Imagine a time long before the walls of Jericho crumbled, when the land was filled with a different kind of power, a different kind of atmosphere. Picture a world where ancient cities thrived, their inhabitants bound by customs and gods, where every mountain, every river and every stone carried a meaning far greater than we can comprehend today. How did the people of that time view their world? How did they live, knowing that just beyond their daily struggles lay the prophetic promise of something far greater, a kingdom that would one day come? Before the fall of Jericho, the world was a realm of ancient kingdoms, each with its own secrets and mysticism. These cities were not just places to live, but hubs of power, culture, and religion. Jericho, the oldest known city in the world, held a unique place in the minds of its inhabitants and those who knew of it. Yet, Jericho was more than just a fortified city. It was a symbol of resistance, a representation of the spiritual battle between the forces of good and evil, and a crucial point in God's unfolding plan for Israel. As we delve into this ancient world, we must first understand the environment in which the Israelites found themselves. The people of Israel had just spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, their faith tested time and time again. The story of Jericho is not merely about a battle, it is about the culmination of generations of waiting, believing, and preparing. But before we get there, we must first understand what the world was like before the fall of this ancient city. The world before Jericho's walls fell was a place of shifting alliances, deep-rooted idolatries, and spiritual battles. The land was populated by various peoples: the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and many others. These groups lived under the rule of their kings and priests, worshipping gods of their own making, often in temples built upon high places. Their religious practices involved sacrifices and rituals, seeking to appease their gods, hoping for favor in matters of fertility, war, and prosperity. The culture was steeped in the occult. The people believed in magic, divination, and the power of sacred sites. Ancient cities like Jericho were not just military strongholds. They were also spiritual centers, places where the divine and the human intersected. These cities, especially Jericho, were fortresses that housed not only the physical might of their rulers, but the spiritual authority of their priests and prophets. The inhabitants of Jericho and surrounding regions lived in fear of divine retribution, but also in the hope of divine favor, a delicate balance of fear and trust in their gods. Yet, there was something fundamentally different about the Israelites, God's chosen people. For them, there was no idol to appease, no earthly king to serve. They were a people set apart, guided by the laws given to them by the God of Israel. Unlike their neighbors, the Israelites didn't seek blessings from carved images, but from a God they believed to be all-powerful, who had delivered them from Egypt and would guide them into the Promised Land. This is the context into which the story of Jericho unfolds. A world filled with spiritual darkness and false worship, but one in which God's light would shine. In the wilderness, God had prepared his people for the moment they would enter Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. But before they could enter, they had to face the mighty city of Jericho. This fortified city, with its towering walls and impenetrable defenses, seemed like an impossible obstacle. Yet, the Israelites didn't rely on their own strength to overcome Jericho. They relied on God's word and his promise, and that promise was about to be fulfilled in the most miraculous way. Before Jericho's fall, the Israelites were living in anticipation. They knew that God had a plan for them, a plan that involved taking the land promised to their ancestors. But how could they possibly defeat such a powerful enemy? How could they overcome the strongholds of Jericho? The answer lay in the faithfulness of God and in the instructions he had given them through Joshua. Joshua, the leader of Israel, stood at the edge of this great city with the weight of the promise on his shoulders. His mission was not only to conquer Jericho, but to prepare his people to take possession of the land God had sworn to give them. Joshua knew that the success of this mission didn't lie in military might, but in obedience to God's commands. The plan was simple, yet it would require unwavering faith and trust in God's timing. The strategy for taking Jericho, as recorded in the Bible in the book of Joshua, was not one of conventional warfare. There were no battering rams, no catapults, no sieging armies. The Israelites were commanded to march around the city silently for 6 days, with the priests blowing their trumpets. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and then, at God's command, the walls of Jericho would collapse. This was a battle not won by human hands, but by divine intervention. The people of Jericho, on the other hand, were filled with fear. They had heard of the miracles that God had performed for Israel, the parting of the Red Sea, the manna from heaven, the victory over the Amalekites. They knew that Israel was a people led by a mighty God, and this knowledge paralyzed them. The citizens of Jericho could see the Israelites encamped outside their city walls, waiting for something they could not understand, something they could not control. But despite the fear, Jericho stood firm. Its walls remained unyielding, its gates locked tight. The spiritual darkness that had enveloped this city for centuries seemed impenetrable. It was a place that resisted God's will, that trusted in its own strength and idols, rather than in the Creator of the universe. And yet, God's plan was not for the walls to stand. The time had come for Jericho to fall, not by the might of Israel, but by the power of God. What does this teach us today? In the world before the fall of Jericho, we see a powerful illustration of how the forces of good and evil stand in opposition. The people of Jericho trusted in their idols and their walls, believing that they were safe from any threat. But the Israelites, by faith, trusted in God alone, knowing that no wall, no king, no army could stand against the will of the Almighty. Before the walls of Jericho fell, the Israelites had to trust in God's plan, even when it seemed illogical. Their victory would come not through conventional warfare, but through obedience, through following God's instructions step by step, and through their unwavering faith in His promises. This is the essence of the world before Jericho's fall, the world of contrast between human strength and divine power, between the walls that stand in our lives and the God who can bring them down. As we continue exploring this ancient world, we will uncover more about the significance of Jericho's fall, the deeper spiritual meaning behind the battle, and how it relates to us today. Stay tuned, because the revelations ahead will change the way you view not only the story of Jericho, but your own journey of faith. As we continue our exploration of the world before the fall of Jericho, we must recognize that the battle was not just physical, but deeply spiritual. Jericho's walls represented much more than a mere fortress of stone and mortar. These walls were a manifestation of the spiritual strongholds that had held the city in darkness for generations. They symbolized the defiance of God's will, the refusal to surrender to the Almighty, and the depths of idolatry that had taken root in the hearts of its people. The spiritual landscape of Jericho was dominated by false worship and idolization of foreign gods. The Canaanites, who inhabited Jericho, had long turned away from the true God. They worshipped deities such as Baal and Asherah, gods of fertility and war, whose rituals involved grotesque acts of sacrifice and sin. These idols had ensnared the people's hearts, leading them into deep spiritual blindness. They trusted in their gods for protection, fertility, and prosperity, but their gods had no power to save them from the living God, the creator of heaven and earth. The presence of such spiritual darkness within the city was not just a reflection of the inhabitants' sinful choices, but a direct challenge to the will of God. Jericho, as the first city the Israelites encountered upon entering the Promised Land, stood as a symbol of the spiritual battle that would unfold. It was a city that represented everything Israel was called to conquer, both physically and spiritually. And it was a city that needed to be defeated in order to establish the rule of God in the land he had promised to his people. In the book of Joshua, we see God giving explicit instructions to the Israelites regarding how to approach Jericho. In Joshua chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, the Lord tells Joshua that Jericho has been given into your hands, but that the people are to follow a very specific set of actions. They must march around the city for 6 days, with priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, blowing their trumpets. On the 7th day, they are to march around the city 7 times, and then, when the priests blow their trumpets again, the people are to shout, and the walls will come down. This command was not just a military strategy, it was a divine decree. The act of marching around the city was an act of obedience, an act of faith. By obeying God's instructions, the Israelites were demonstrating their trust in His power and authority, acknowledging that it was not their own strength that would bring victory, but God's power alone. It was a powerful reminder that victory in spiritual battles does not come through human effort, but through complete reliance on God. But why was the 7th day so significant? In biblical tradition, the number 7 holds great significance. It is often associated with completeness and perfection. On the 7th day, after 6 days of marching and silence, the Israelites were called to make a loud proclamation, a shout of victory that would signal the complete destruction of Jericho's stronghold. This act was not just about the physical destruction of the city's walls. It symbolized the breaking down of spiritual barriers, the dismantling of the enemy's strongholds. The walls of Jericho were not merely physical obstacles. They were representative of the spiritual barriers that stood between the Israelites and the promises of God. Just as Jericho's walls kept the people of Israel from entering the city, so too do the walls of sin, doubt, and fear often keep us from receiving the fullness of God's blessings. These walls can be built in our hearts by our own choices, by the lies of the enemy, and by our own failures to trust in God's power. But just as God brought down the walls of Jericho, He can tear down the walls in our lives if we walk in faith and obedience. The walls of Jericho also serve as a powerful symbol of resistance to God's plan. Just as the city resisted the Israelites, there are spiritual forces in our world today that resist the truth of God's word. These forces can manifest in many ways: through personal sin, through the corrupt systems of the world, or through the spiritual blindness of those around us. Yet the story of Jericho teaches us that no matter how strong these forces may appear, they are no match for the power of God. Jericho's walls may have stood tall and unyielding, but they were no match for the command of God. When God spoke, the very elements of creation obeyed. The earth itself trembled, and the walls of Jericho came crashing down, revealing the truth that God's will cannot be thwarted. This is a truth that we must hold on to in our own lives. No matter what obstacles we face, no matter how strong the walls may seem, God is able to bring them down. But we must be willing to trust Him and follow His instructions. As the Israelites began their march, the priests led the way, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence among His people. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel, representing the throne of God, His holiness, and His covenant with His people. Its presence in the midst of the procession was a reminder that it was not the strength of the Israelites that would bring victory, but the presence and power of God Himself. The Ark was also a symbol of God's faithfulness. When the Israelites crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, the waters parted just as the Red Sea had parted before. The Ark of the Covenant had led the way, a tangible sign that God was with His people. Now, as they marched around Jericho, the Ark once again led them, showing that their success would not come from their own power, but from God's presence and guidance. The priests blew their trumpets as they marched, announcing God's presence and authority. The sound of the trumpets was not just a call to battle, it was a declaration of God's sovereignty. It was a declaration that He, not the gods of Jericho or the strength of the city's walls, was the true king. The trumpets were a call for the people to listen and obey, to prepare for what was about to happen. And when the final trumpet sounded on the seventh day, the walls would come down and victory would be assured. This procession was not just a military maneuver, it was a spiritual act, a declaration that God was sovereign and that his people trusted in his plan. The act of marching around Jericho for 7 days was a powerful reminder that in spiritual battles we must be patient, obedient, and steadfast. We may not always understand why God asks us to do certain things, but we must trust that his ways are higher than our ways, and when the time is right, he will bring down the walls that stand in our way. As the Israelites continued their march, they were not just preparing for a physical battle, they were preparing for a spiritual victory. The world before Jericho's fall was filled with spiritual forces that sought to oppose God's plan, but the walls of Jericho were no match for the power of the Almighty. Stay with us as we continue to uncover more of the spiritual lessons hidden in the story of Jericho. This journey is about more than just an ancient battle. It is about the spiritual battles we face today, the walls we need to tear down in our own lives, and the power of God's presence to bring victory. As we delve further into the story of Jericho's fall, we begin to uncover the central theme that makes this event truly remarkable: the power of obedience and faith in God's word. This was not merely a military conquest, it was an act of absolute trust in God's plan, despite the odds and appearances. On the surface, the strategy to defeat Jericho might have seemed illogical or even impossible. Marching around a fortified city for days without any immediate sign of victory could have left the Israelites discouraged, doubtful, or questioning God's instructions. The walls of Jericho stood tall and impenetrable, seemingly unassailable by human force. Yet, this is where God's ways diverge from human reasoning. In the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, God often calls us to step out in faith and obedience, even when his plan doesn't make immediate sense. In Joshua chapter 6 verse 2, God tells Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." God gives the Israelites victory before they even begin their conquest, demonstrating that the victory is already secured by his will. But it was only through obedience that the victory would become a reality. The Israelites had to act according to God's command and trust that he would do the work. This act of obedience was not just about following instructions for the sake of following them. It was about acknowledging the authority of God and placing complete trust in his timing. God commanded the Israelites to march around the city for 6 days in silence, and on the 7th day, after marching around the city 7 times, they were to shout. The people were required to stay silent until the final day, and only when the time came for them to shout did the walls fall. Why silence before the shout? This silence was an essential part of the obedience. It was a time for the people to wait upon God, to trust in his timing, and to demonstrate their reliance on his strength rather than their own. The silence could also symbolize a time of reflection, a time to prepare spiritually for what was about to happen. It served as a reminder that victory does not come from human efforts alone, but from God's power and sovereignty. For us, this teaches us an important lesson. God's timing is always perfect, even when we don't see the immediate results of our faith and obedience. Sometimes we may feel like we are waiting in silence, wondering when God's promises will be fulfilled in our lives. But just as the Israelites were called to trust God's plan for the fall of Jericho, we too must trust that God's timing and methods are perfect. Even in moments of silence or waiting, God is at work. When the 7th day came, after the Israelites had marched around the city 7 times, they shouted as instructed, and the walls came tumbling down. In Joshua chapter 6 verse 20, we read, "When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city." The walls did not fall because of human strength or tactics, but because of the power of God. The Israelites' obedience to his command, combined with their faith in his power, led to the collapse of Jericho's walls. This moment is a powerful reminder that when we align ourselves with God's will and act in obedience, he will move mountains on our behalf. The walls that seem impossible to break, the obstacles that appear too great to overcome, will crumble in the face of God's sovereign will. But our role is to remain obedient, to trust in his timing, and to follow his guidance even when the path seems unclear. The fall of Jericho also demonstrates the profound difference between man's approach to battle and God's approach. Human armies rely on strategy, strength, and weapons to bring about victory. But in this case, God used a strategy that seemed completely counterintuitive, marching around the city in silence for days, followed by a shout. This act defied the logic of warfare, showing that God's ways are higher than our ways. He is not limited by human understanding or abilities, and he often works in ways that challenge our expectations. This story invites us to reflect on our own faith journey. When faced with spiritual battles or challenges, do we trust in God's methods, even when they seem unconventional? Are we willing to follow his instructions even when we don't understand them? Are we ready to be obedient, even when the path forward seems uncertain, or when the victory doesn't come immediately? The act of marching around Jericho also symbolizes the perseverance required in our walk with God. The Israelites were not promised immediate victory, but were called to remain steadfast in their obedience. They had to march for 6 days, following the same routine, with no visible sign of progress. There were no immediate results. There were no walls crumbling after the first day, the second day, or even the 6th day. But on the 7th day, when the time was right, the walls came down. This perseverance is a powerful lesson for us. Many times in our lives, we may feel like we are marching without seeing any immediate results. We may feel like our prayers are unanswered, or that our struggles are without end. But like the Israelites, we must continue to walk in faith, trusting that God's timing is perfect and that he will bring about the breakthrough at just the right moment. This story is also a powerful reminder that our victory is not ours to claim, but God's. It is God who tears down the walls in our lives. It is God who gives us the strength to overcome the challenges we face. Our role is to remain obedient, to trust in his plan, and to rely on his power. The victory in Jericho was not won by the Israelites' strength, but by God's might. In the same way, our victories in life, whether they be personal struggles, spiritual battles, or challenges in our relationships, are not won by our strength, but by God's power. We must place our trust in him and allow his power to work through us. When we do, we can be confident that the walls in our lives, no matter how insurmountable they seem, will eventually come crashing down. The fall of Jericho is not just an ancient story. It is a timeless lesson for all of us, a reminder that God is faithful to his promises, that obedience and faith are key to victory, and that his ways are far greater than our own. Let this story encourage you to stand firm in your faith, to trust in God's power, and to know that no wall is too great for God to bring down. As we reflect on the power of obedience and faith in Jericho's fall, we are reminded that God is always at work, even when we don't see the results immediately. Our role is to trust him, to remain obedient, and to be patient as we wait for his perfect timing. As we conclude our exploration of Jericho's fall, we must reflect deeply on the eternal lessons embedded within this ancient event. The story of Jericho is not merely a historical account. It is a spiritual blueprint for us today. Through the walls that fell, God is revealing to us profound truths about his sovereignty, his plans for our lives, and how we can experience breakthroughs in our own personal spiritual journeys. The first lesson we learn is that God's promises are always true, even when they seem impossible. Jericho's walls were towering and seemingly impregnable. The city stood as a formidable symbol of opposition, defiance, and strength. To human eyes, Victory appeared utterly unachievable, but God, in his infinite wisdom, had already ordained that the city would fall into the hands of his people. He had already given the victory before the Israelites even began their march. This truth resonates with us in our own lives. God has made many promises to his children, promises of hope, deliverance, and victory. Yet, there are times when we face situations that seem too difficult or too impossible to overcome. Jericho's fall is a reminder that no matter how impossible our situation may seem, God is still in control. His promises are unwavering, and his plans for us will always prevail. But what is required on our part? Obedience. As we saw earlier, the Israelites' victory over Jericho did not come through military strength or clever strategies. It came through obedience to God's instructions. This simple but profound act of obedience is the key that unlocks God's blessings in our lives. Even when God's plan doesn't make sense, we are called to trust and obey, knowing that he sees what we cannot. The walls of Jericho were not brought down by human hands, but by the obedience of God's people. Our own walls, whether they be emotional, relational, or spiritual, can only be brought down when we align ourselves with God's will and trust in his ways. This principle is further underscored by the fact that the Israelites were not to fight in a traditional manner. They were not to use weapons or military tactics. Instead, they were to march in silence for 6 days, and on the 7th day they were to shout. The message here is clear. God's power operates outside the realm of human understanding and effort. We are often inclined to solve problems on our own terms, relying on our abilities, wisdom, or resources. But God asks us to trust in his power, even when the solution doesn't align with our understanding of how things should work. Jericho's fall teaches us that true victory comes when we surrender our methods and trust in God's supernatural ways. Another lesson is the power of perseverance. The Israelites did not experience immediate results. For 6 days, they marched around the city without seeing any visible change. There was no sign of the walls crumbling, no indication that their efforts were accomplishing anything. Yet they persevered, trusting that God would fulfill his promise in his perfect timing. This period of waiting was critical. It was not wasted time, it was a time of spiritual preparation. Just as the Israelites had to be patient and wait on God's timing, we too must learn to persevere through seasons of waiting in our own lives. It's in those moments of waiting that our faith is tested, refined, and strengthened. In our fast-paced world, where we are used to instant results and immediate gratification, the story of Jericho stands in stark contrast. It challenges us to develop patience and trust in God's perfect timing. When we face difficulties, we often want immediate relief, but God's plan is rarely rushed. His timing is always right, even if we can't see the full picture at the moment. The story of Jericho encourages us to remain faithful, to keep moving forward, and to trust that God will bring about the breakthrough at the right moment. There's also a deeper spiritual lesson embedded in the fall of Jericho, the idea of holiness and separation. Before the Israelites could take the city, they had to follow God's instructions exactly, including the command to avoid taking any of the spoils of war for themselves. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 18, God warns the Israelites, "But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them." This instruction was not arbitrary. It was meant to preserve the purity of the Israelites and ensure that they did not become contaminated by the idolatrous practices of the Canaanites. Jericho's fall was not just a physical victory, but also a spiritual one, where God was setting apart his people and sanctifying them for his purposes. In the same way, God calls us to live lives of holiness and separation from the world. He asks us to remain faithful to his word, to avoid sin, and to keep ourselves untainted by the things of this world that can draw us away from his presence. The story of Jericho teaches us that our victory is not just about overcoming external obstacles. It's also about maintaining purity in our hearts and lives. As we apply these lessons to our lives today, we are reminded that God is always at work, even when we don't see immediate results. Just as the Israelites had to march in silence before the walls fell, we too must wait in faith, trusting that God is moving behind the scenes. Our walls, whether they are physical, emotional, or spiritual, will eventually fall when we walk in obedience, perseverance, and holiness. Finally, Jericho's fall points us to the ultimate victory we have in Christ. Just as the Israelites overcame Jericho and entered into the promised land, we too have been promised victory through Jesus Christ. He has already won the ultimate battle on the cross, defeating sin, death, and the power of the enemy. Our victory is secured through him, and like the Israelites, we are called to walk in obedience, trust in God's timing, and live lives that honor him. In closing, the fall of Jericho is more than just an ancient story of conquest. It is a powerful testimony of God's faithfulness, his sovereignty, and his ability to bring down any wall in our lives. As we walk in obedience, faith, and perseverance, we can trust that God will bring about the breakthrough in his perfect timing. No matter what obstacles we face, we can be confident that with God on our side, the walls will fall and victory will be ours. Let this story encourage you to trust in God's plan for your life, to remain steadfast in your faith, and to know that no wall is too high, no barrier too strong for God to bring down. As we conclude, remember, if God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. Our victory, like the Israelites at Jericho, is assured by the power of our Almighty God.